Okay, today we're going to talk about food chains and food webs, and we're going to look at energy pyramid diagrams. And to start us off, we'll look at trophic levels. So when we look at a food chain, each link in a food chain is known as a trophic level. And the trophic levels represent a feeding step in the transfer of energy and matter in an ecosystem. So a food chain is just one organism that eats another, and it goes along in this nice sort of chain. And a food web are interconnecting food chains. So let's look at biomass first before we get into like food chains and food webs. A biomass is the amount of organic matter comprising a group of organisms in a habitat. And as you move up the food chain, both available energy and the biomass are going to decrease. So energy gets lost as heat, and also biomass is going to decrease as we go up. So that amount of organic matter. Energy is transferred upwards, but it's diminished with each transfer. So if you look at this picture, you can see that the energy is going to start to decrease, and the greatest amount of energy is over here at the bottom, where we have the producers. Those are considered to be our plants. They're our autotrophs. They produce their own food through photosynthesis, and they have the greatest amount of energy. And then as you go to the primary consumers and the secondary levels and the third levels and so on, energy is going to be lost. And it is lost as 10% as you sort of go up, and then you finally are going to get to the 1%, but you started with the 100%. This is just another picture of a food web energy sort of pyramid. It almost reminds me of like the food pyramid that you might have learned about in health. Producers are always going to start a food chain off, a food web off, or an energy pyramid diagram will always start with the producer, and the last stage will always be a decomposer. It doesn't show it in this one, and some of them don't show it, but we always would end with a decomposer. So if we look at a food chain, it's a simple model that shows how matter and energy move through an ecosystem. So again, we would start at the bottom here with our algae and sort of our floating plants. And then we would go to the next organism, and then the next organism, and the next. And what happens is that the direction of the arrowhead is going to be the organism that actually gets the energy, and it is the one that is going to be eating the thing before it. Here's another picture where, again, we're going to start with our producers. Those are our grass. Those are our plants. They're going to get their energy from the sun. By the process of photosynthesis, we have our primary consumer, which is our grasshopper, our secondary consumer, which is our snake, and we're going to end all the way with the decomposer, which can be bacteria or it can be fungi like mushrooms and molds, and they'll break down the remains of the dead organisms. But the arrowhead, the top of the arrowhead, is always going to point to the organism that eats the thing before it, and so it's getting the energy, because some people get confused by the direction of the arrowhead. Food webs just show all of the possible feeding relationships in a community at each trophic level. It represents really a network of interacting, interconnected food chains. And as you know, you don't eat the same thing every day. You don't have like a hamburger for lunch and hamburger for dinner and a hamburger for a snack and a hamburger for breakfast. So because you don't eat all of the same things, the best representations of these trophic levels would be a food web, showing that you eat a bunch of different organisms. And so this is showing you the difference between a food chain, which is just that one path of energy, and a food web, which are all the possible paths of energy. Because again, most organisms just don't eat one thing. But the food chain is easier to understand because it is just going from one organism to the next to the next. And the food webs, they can get a little tricky. You got to like get your finger in there and see where the direction of the arrowhead is pointing to. This is another picture of a food web. Again, we're always going to start with our plants and then work our way up. Another picture here. Here's another one. Food webs, again, are a little bit more confusing, but you can see they start with the marsh vegetation and then they sort of branch off from there. Another one. All right, and now we're going to get into cycling, because as I might have said earlier in this or the other day when I had one of these videos that I was taping, when we look at energy. Energy is always going to flow through the ecosystem, but materials or nutrients are always going to get cycled. And there's 3 ways that these materials get cycled. It's the water cycle, the carbon or carbon-oxygen cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. And cycling of materials is going to provide this homeostasis, that stable internal environment. So if we look at the water cycle, you've learned about that a long time ago. You're going to deal with evaporation, and you can also deal with where it goes up and cools and condense, falls back down as precipitation, and transpiration is it coming off of the leaves of the plants. This is a picture of the water cycle. The carbon, I like to say the carbon-oxygen cycle. This is just photosynthesis and respiration, and it just moves carbon and oxygen through the environment, and it does it by photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and we remember those formulas from before. This is just a picture of the carbon cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is basically where we take nitrogen from the soil, and it's used to break down the remains and return nutrients to the soil. Most of our planet, just for some extra information, deals with atmospheric nitrogen. It's nearly like 78 to 80% of the air, but we can't use it in that form, so it has to be converted. And so lightning and bacteria can convert that nitrogen into a usable form. Only in certain bacteria and industrial technologies can fix bacteria. We call them nitrogen fixing. Nitrogen fixation converts atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium, which can be used to make organic compounds like amino acids. And if you look at the nitrogen cycle, this slide we don't really need to know. It's showing the symbiotic relationship, which we don't really need to know about. So I'm just going to skip over this one. Some nitrogen fixing bacteria can live in the free soil, and some nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria are essential to maintain the fertility of semi-aquatic environments like rice paddies. These are all just extra information. We don't really need to know this. This is a picture. Basically, the nutrients in the soil break down the remains of dead organisms, and it again returns nutrients to that soil, and then we'll plant the crops there and so on. And bacteria helps with the breakdown of that. Another picture of it. And we're going to end here.